My name is Marion Holt. I'm 67. The house smelled of baked salmon and rosemary when the timer went off. I had set the table for 4, as I always did. Old habits die harder than people think. Outside, the Portland rain tapped against the kitchen window, steady and polite, the kind that keeps you company when no one else does. I lifted the lid of the rice cooker, letting a cloud of steam blur my glasses. That was when my phone buzzed on the counter. A photo filled the screen. My son, my daughter, and their spouses, raising glasses under the amber lights of a downtown restaurant. The caption read, "Promotion dinner for Dad." For a moment, I thought there must be a mistake. I scrolled, waiting for an invitation that never came. Then another message blinked below it. From my daughter, "Mom, don't forget to finish the leftovers in the fridge." The words sat there like ice on the screen. I stared at them until the phone went dark. My reflection faint in the glass, an older woman with steam-blurred glasses and hands that didn't know what to do. I turned off the stove, though the salmon hadn't finished browning. The rice cooker clicked again, louder this time, as if reminding me it had done its part. I placed a single plate on the table, out of habit, and poured myself tea. The house was quiet, except for the rain and the soft hum of the refrigerator, the one that held the leftovers my daughter thought I needed. I ate a few bites, unable to taste anything, then stood by the window watching the streetlights tremble on wet pavement. When I finally turned away, I noticed my late husband's empty chair at the head of the table. For the first time, it felt like the whole room understood what that absence meant. I washed the dishes carefully, one by one, and left the light on in the kitchen. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Leaving the air washed and cool, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the clean counters and the single cup I'd left to dry. The silence felt too large for one person. David's mug sat by the sink, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. Lila's coat hung on the chair, still carrying the faint scent of her perfume. Everything in this house bore traces of them, yet none of it seemed to need me. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture I'd once chosen, the curtains I'd sewn, the framed school photos of my children. Their faces smiled from another time when their eyes still searched for mine, when a mother's presence meant safety, not routine. In the hallway, a stack of unopened mail waited on the console table. On top was the box of tea I'd bought for Lila's birthday last month, still wrapped in gold paper. She'd said, "Oh, Mom, you didn't have to," and then left it there, forgotten. The doorbell startled me. It was Mrs. Parker from next door, holding a potted basil plant. "I saw the photos online," she said cheerfully. "Your family looked so happy at that restaurant." What a night! I smiled as best I could, thanked her, and took the plant inside. The smell of basil filled the empty kitchen, sharp and green. I set it on the counter, beside the cold teapot. When the door closed, I stood for a while, listening. No voices upstairs, no footsteps, no laughter, just the low hum of the refrigerator again, steady, dependable, indifferent. I looked around the house I had once called home and wondered, not for the first time, when I had quietly stopped belonging to it. By the end of the week, the house had settled into a silence so deep it almost had weight. David and his family were away for the weekend, leaving only the faint ticking of the hallway clock to keep me company. I used to welcome quiet. It meant peace. But now it felt like being erased, one day at a time. I decided to sort through the mail stacked on the console table. Most of it was bills and flyers. But one thick envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to David Holt and family from a real estate firm in Bend, the town where Arthur and I used to spend our summers. I opened it without thinking, and my breath caught. Inside were legal documents, an offer and contract for the sale of Arthur's old cabin by the lake. At the bottom, in tidy blue ink, was my son's signature. My name wasn't anywhere on it. I sat down, the paper trembling in my hands. I remembered painting that cabin's porch with Arthur, our laughter echoing across the water. He'd left it to me for peace and rest. He'd said, to see it turned into profit on paper felt like a quiet betrayal outside. Clouds gathered over Mount Tabor again, heavy and gray. I folded the letter neatly and placed it back into the envelope, then went upstairs. My suitcase was still in the closet, the same one I'd taken on family trips decades ago. I filled it slowly, 2 dresses, a sweater, my journal, and the old photo of Arthur I kept on the nightstand. On the kitchen counter, I left a note, taking a short trip. Don't worry. The rain started as I stepped outside. Soft at first, then steady. I pulled my coat tighter and walked toward the bus stop without looking back. The suitcase wheels hissed over the wet pavement, keeping time with the sound of my heartbeat. The bus rolled south through the drizzle, past fields that blurred into the gray sky. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. By evening, I found myself in Corvallis, a small, quiet town I hadn't visited since my library days. The air smelled of rain and roasted coffee. I wandered down Main Street, suitcase in hand, until I saw a sign I recognized, the Juniper Cup. Years ago, a woman named Helen ran this cafe near the university. We had worked together for a few summers cataloging books for the library's outreach program. I hadn't thought of her in years. When I stepped inside, the same bell above the door chimed softly. Behind the counter, Helen looked up, silver-haired now, but unmistakable. For a second, disbelief crossed her face. Then warmth. Marion Holt. My goodness, it's been forever. We sat by the window with steaming mugs of chamomile tea. I told her, vaguely, that I needed a few days away. She didn't press for details. Helen had the rare gift of listening without demanding the truth. I still rent the room upstairs, she said finally. It's small but cozy. You can stay as long as you need. The room was simple, a single bed, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the riverfront. When I opened it, the air carried the faint scent of rain and cinnamon from the cafe below. For the first time in weeks, I breathed easily. That evening, as we closed the cafe, Helen mentioned a community art class held at the Civic Center. You always had an eye for detail, she said. Smiling, it might help to keep your hands busy. I hesitated. But something in her tone, gentle, matter-of-fact, felt like an invitation back into life. The next morning, I walked there, still unsure of what I was looking for. Inside the bright classroom, people my age were laughing, dipping brushes into trays of ink and watercolor. A tall man with kind eyes handed me a brush. First time he asked, I nodded. And when the brush touched paper, the quiet around me felt less like loneliness and more like space to begin again. The following week, I returned to the community center, still uncertain if I belonged there. The calligraphy classroom smelled faintly of ink and lemon oil, the kind used to clean old desks. Around me, a dozen people chatted quietly, dipping brushes into porcelain wells, their hands moving with calm precision. The instructor, Mr. Peterson, was a tall man in his 70s with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth instead of authority. Calligraphy, he said, isn't about perfect lines, it's about rhythm. The hand reveals the heart. He placed a brush in my hand and guided it gently across the page. My first stroke wobbled, the ink bleeding into the paper like a hesitation laid bare. Good, he murmured. Now breathe. I tried again. Slower this time. The second line curved cleanly, steady and soft. Something inside me loosened. The brush no longer felt foreign. It felt like remembering a language I used to know. By the end of class, I had written a single character harmony. The ink shimmered faintly under the light, uneven but alive. Mr. Peterson paused behind me, studying it. You have balance, he said simply. That can't be taught. I smiled. The first real one in a long while. When I returned to the room above the cafe that evening, Helen was closing up. She looked up from wiping a table. "You look different," she said. "Lighter." "Maybe," I said, setting down my satchel. Maybe I remembered something I'd forgotten. After dinner, I climbed the stairs and sat by the window. The town below glowed softly in the mist. The faint hum of cars mixing with the river's rhythm. My phone blinked a voicemail. Lila's voice filled the room. "Mom, we're worried. Please come home. David says maybe we can talk about everything. Just call us." "Okay." Her voice trembled slightly, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or habit. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then pressed delete. The message vanished, leaving only the quiet sound of rain against the glass. I dipped my brush again, the ink spreading across the paper. Each stroke steadied my hands and, somehow, my heart. It had been nearly 3 weeks since I left Portland. The days had grown gentler, slower, filled with small rituals of ink and tea, of quiet laughter with Helen downstairs. I no longer checked my phone. I thought perhaps the silence between my children and me had settled into its own kind of peace. That illusion ended on a Thursday afternoon. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and when I turned, David was standing there, his jacket still wet from the rain. Behind him came Lila, her face pale and tight. For a heartbeat, none of us spoke. "Mom," David said at last, his voice careful, too calm. "You weren't answering our calls." I didn't think there was much left to say. I set my cup down slowly. Helen looked from me to them, then quietly retreated to the kitchen. Sensing what was about to unfold, Lila stepped forward. "We were worried," she began, but the tone betrayed something sharper than concern. "You just disappeared. Do you know how that looks?" "How it looks," I repeated, meeting her eyes, to whom David exhaled. "We didn't mean to hurt you. Mom, you left before we could explain about the cabin. It was just paperwork temporary. We thought you'd agree once you understood." I felt the tremor rising in my hands. "You sold your father's cabin without asking me. You put your name on something that wasn't yours." Lila crossed her arms. "Oh, come on. You don't even go there anymore. You don't need that money we do." The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. Even David flinched. "Lila," he hissed. But she lifted her chin. "Someone has to say it. You're living alone, spending your days drawing letters, while we're drowning in bills. Is that fair?" My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to remind her of the years I'd worked 2 jobs, the nights I stayed up sewing her dresses, the savings her father and I built with blistered hands. But my voice would not come. David rubbed his face, looking older than I remembered. "Let's not fight here," he said quietly. "Mom, maybe we can talk tomorrow properly." I nodded, though the room had already started spinning. The air felt thin, my chest heavy. Helen returned with a glass of water, but before I could reach it, the cup slipped from my hand and shattered. I heard someone shout my name, felt David's arms catching me as the floor rushed up to meet me, then nothing. When I opened my eyes, the light was too white, too still. Machines hummed softly beside me. My right arm felt heavy, my tongue thick and slow. David's face appeared in the blur, his eyes swollen, red-rimmed. "Mom," he whispered, gripping my hand. "You scared me to death." I wanted to tell him I was all right, but the words dissolved before they could form. All I could do was blink, once. Twice enough for him to see that I heard him, that I was still here. The world came back to me in fragments, soft, beeping, disinfectant. The weight of a blanket across my chest. My right arm wouldn't move, my throat burned, and my head throbbed in slow waves. When my eyes finally adjusted, I saw David slumped in the chair beside my bed. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot, hair unkempt. "Mom," he said as soon as I stirred, his voice breaking. "You're awake." I wanted to answer, but only a faint sound came out. He reached for a cup, dipped a sponge in water, and touched it to my lips. "The doctor says you had a mild stroke. You'll recover, but it'll take time." He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. I could see the guilt in every line of his face, the exhaustion. The fear that maybe he'd waited too long to care. The days that followed blurred together, nurses checking my vitals, the quiet hum of the IV, the sterile stillness of hospital mornings. David rarely left my side. He brought soup from the cafeteria, folded my blanket, read the newspaper aloud even when I couldn't respond. Lila never came. Once, I heard him on the phone with her in the hallway, his voice sharp. "She's your mother too, Lila. You could at least call." Then silence, and a sigh that said everything. On the fourth day, a knock came at the door. Mr. Peterson entered, holding a bouquet of carnations and a gentle smile. "Mrs. Holt," he said softly, "you gave us all a scare." I managed a small nod. He set the flowers by the window. "Your piece, Harmony, was chosen for display at the community exhibition. The whole class was so proud. They said it had a quiet strength. Something inside me trembled. That one word, harmony, had been my attempt to find balance again. And now it hung in a gallery where people could see it, even when I couldn't hold a brush." Mr. Peterson squeezed my hand gently. "You have more resilience than you know." Then he left, the scent of carnations lingering behind him. David sat silently for a long time after. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, cutting soft lines across my bed. He finally spoke, voice low and unsteady. "I forgot you were also Marion," he whispered. "Not just Mom." The words found their way through the haze, warm and aching. I turned my head toward the window, blinking hard as tears welled and fell, tracing the same slow rhythm as the rain outside. By early spring, my strength had returned enough for me to walk without the cane. The doctors called it a remarkable recovery, but I knew it was more than medicine. It was resolve, something rebuilt quietly in hospital rooms and long nights of reflection. When David offered to drive me home, I agreed. The house looked the same, yet I saw it differently now. The walls no longer felt like shelter, but reminders of what had been taken for granted. The kitchen still smelled faintly of basil from Mrs. Parker's plant, now wilted in the corner. That evening, David and Lila arrived for dinner. The silence between them said they'd argued before coming. I had prepared tea and a folder of documents. When we sat down, I spoke before anyone could begin another apology. "I've been thinking about the cabin," I said evenly, "and about what comes next." Lila's eyes flicked up, cautious. David shifted in his chair. "I want the sale to go through," I continued, "but I've redrafted the terms. 40% of the proceeds will go to me, enough for my independence. 60% will go to you two. I've also arranged a fund for Ella's education." Lila's lips parted. Surprised. "You'd do that after everything." "I'm still your mother," I said, "and she's still my granddaughter." David frowned. "You don't have to move out." "Mom, we can help. You could stay." "I've made my decision." I slid a brochure across the table, a senior living community near Mount Tabor. The photos showed gardens, walking trails, and a small art studio. They have calligraphy classes and a library. I'll be fine there. David's voice cracked. "You don't trust us anymore." I looked at him gently. "I trust you to live your life. I just need to live mine." Lila stared at the papers, then quietly said, "Maybe it's for the best." Her tone held no defiance this time, only fatigue and something close to understanding. The three of us sat for a while in fragile peace, steam rising from our cups. Outside, the first spring rain began to fall, washing the city clean. I turned toward the window and felt the weight in my chest ease, like ink finally settling into the right line. 3 months later, the scent of fresh ink and blooming magnolia filled the community center. My calligraphy students were setting up for the spring exhibition. Laughter and chatter bouncing softly off the walls. The theme was renewal. And my piece 4 bold characters, meaning stillness within movement, hung near the entrance. I'd grown used to the rhythm of this new life, mornings spent writing by the window, afternoons teaching, evenings walking through Mount Tabor's garden paths. There was no grand loneliness here, only quiet purpose. When I turned from the display table, I saw him, David, standing near the doorway in a navy jacket, a bouquet of tulips in hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, shy and uncertain. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic. I took the flowers. You came, that's enough." The event began with a few short speeches. When it was my turn, I stepped to the podium, hands steady. "Here," I said to the small crowd, "I'm not just Mom or Mrs. Holt. I'm Marion," and it turns out that's enough. Applause rippled through the hall. When I glanced toward the back, David was standing with his arms crossed, not out of defiance, but to hide the emotion that had reached his eyes. He clapped last and longest. Afterward, he helped me pack the framed pieces into my bag. As we walked to the car, the late sun slanted through the glass doors, and for the first time in years, our silence felt easy. The evening air was cool, brushed with the scent of rain-soaked earth. I had just finished tidying the small apartment when a knock sounded at the door. David stood there, holding a bouquet of white lilies and a brown envelope. "The property papers," he said softly. "Everything's finalized. Your share's in the account." I invited him in. We sat by the small table, sharing tea as the light faded outside. The conversation flowed gently about his work, about Ella's new school project, about nothing that hurt. For once, our words didn't circle back to apology or regret. When he rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "You seem happy here, Mom," he said. "I'm glad." "Thank you," I replied. "So am I." He smiled, a real one this time, and walked down the quiet path toward the parking lot. I watched until his car disappeared beyond the gate, then stepped onto the small porch. The first stars had begun to appear above Mount Tabor. I reached for the switch beside the door, and the porch light glowed warm against the deepening sky. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," I whispered. "It's for peace."